Hello everyone at AsyncAPI Conference. My name is Dave Boyne and thank you for having me today and kind of watching this for the next half an hour. What I'm going to be talking about is cataloging your events with AsyncAPI. And what do I mean by cataloging and documentation? And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. So here's a quick agenda for you. We'll be diving into some initial problems actually that you'll see in what I see in the community kind of talk about and problems that I've had in the past with that initial setup of event-driven architectures and the problems you start to see and emerge as time goes on. So before we dive in, I'm going to introduce you to myself. My name is Dave Boyne. You can find me on Twitter at Boyne123. I'm a senior developer advocate at AWS. Focused on serverless technologies and also event-driven architectures. I'm a father of two, so you might hear them scream in this video. They are in the house, and so listen out for that. Ex-guitar player, and previously before at AWS, I was working in open source full-time, actually part of the AsyncAPI team for a while, and before that working in startups and some large organizations, mainly focused around tooling, developer experiences, and all sorts of things. I also enjoy kind of writing open source software and tools for developers and focusing on event-driven architectures. So let's dive into this talk and talk about the problems of event-driven architectures beyond that initial setup and things that you might see, and maybe some of these things might resonate with you. And as you look around in the community at the moment, you can see actually the adoption of event-driven architecture is growing, right? More and more people are using it, more and more solutions are being developed with a kind of this event architecture in mind. And when you start diving into the reasons why, it's because I believe technology is just making it more accessible, right? Event-driven architecture has actually been around for decades. So it's about the technology and how that's helping us do that. And if we just have a look at some AWS services as an example here, we have things like Amazon EventBridge, which is a serverless event bus, which allows us to send and receive events and map them up to other serverless kind of technologies there. We have kind of step functions that allow us to orchestrate some workflow based on events, and even things like Lambda, right, which allow us to kind of do some compute based on events, funny enough. So the event architectures themselves are actually becoming more and more accessible. And then when we start looking at the benefits of event architectures, you start seeing these kind of words come up. We aim to have loosely coupled systems, especially in this kind of microservices architecture, especially as we have different teams doing different stuff. Event architectures allow us to kind of produce these events and consume them in different teams and process them in different ways, right? And having this loosely coupled system allows us to have this extensibility, which allows us to have consumers come and go as time goes on. So as requirements change in our organization, we can change who's listening or add more listeners and do more and more things. And event architectures just really, really help us from my own experience, just help us get there. And then when you start getting into that kind of flow, you start seeing this agility arise, which is, we need to do X when Y happens. Well, if we are already publishing Y, then we can just do the X anyway, because there's no work that needs to be done there. And as you add events and you start designing your architecture in this particular way, you start to see this kind of agility that emerges. Now, what tends to happen is once you go beyond that initial setup of your event architectures, you start to see some weird kind of problems emerge, right? And normally it's not around the technology, but more around kind of behaviorals and people in general, really, to be honest. You start to kind of question, the producer and consumer responsibilities as an example. So who owns the contract here? Right, or maybe it's validation. Do you validate at the producer level or the consumer level or both? And then in the middle here, we have coupling services with events. So even the event design itself can actually couple you to your producers without you even knowing. Lack of governance and standards as time goes on. Should you be thinking about your event design and the impacts that actually has on your organization? Even to the point of the event naming itself, the unclear event intent. What is the name of our events? Are they past tense? Are they things that have happened? Is it clear what we're looking at? exposed domain information? Are you exposing too much integration or internal information within a particular kind of bounded context or a particular service? Should you be exposing? What kind of domain information should you expose, and where's the line there? Finally, things like, focusing on implementation details rather than behavior of your system, looking at the events and things like event storming there can help. Now, when you start diving into event architectures and you start reading books or white papers or whatever it might be, you start seeing this term arise, which is producers should not know about consumers. And although that's kind of true technically, we want to create this decoupled architectures. What I believe happens, is we take this too literally. And what happens over time is you start to ask yourself, who is producing what? Especially if we have hundreds and hundreds of events and we've scaled this out in our organization, you want to know some basic stuff. Who is producing what event? What version of the event are they producing? Who can I contact? Who owns this event? What information and context around this event? Why was this event created? It could have been created 2 years ago, as an example. So as you start to look and come into these issues, you start to look and wonder, is there any kind of event-driven documentation that can help us solve these initial issues and these problems that we have? Now, luckily for us, this is why we're all here at the conference, we have the AsyncAPI specification, which is great. It allows us to kind of document the producers and consumers using various different kind of protocols and document our channels and be able to have a place where we can actually say, okay, here is my service and this is what you can do to it as a producer or a consumer. This is the kind of stuff that this kind of stuff is doing. Now, the best thing about the kind of specifications and standards in general is we can actually create tools around the specification to help us get to that next level of documentation or that next level of like CLI tools or whatever it might be. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, is introducing Event Catalog. And what is Event Catalog? Now, to explain this, what I want to do is actually want to just focus your attention on these 3 different areas that I've been kind of exploring for the past few years. And these kind of are the things that kind of get me excited personally, which is event architectures, developer tools, and developer experience. Now, over the past few years, I've been diving into event architectures, reading books, experimenting, playing, and developing tools and all sorts of stuff. And I come across this book in particular, recommended to me actually, by James Urquhart, which is called Flow Architectures. Now, James looks into kind of the future of event streaming and event-driven integrations within our organizations. And if you think about this for a minute, you think about data and cross-boundary data within your organization. We are always integrating with third-party providers. Especially kind of startups, we're looking at different SaaS providers and things we can integrate with there, or data lakes and all sorts of things. So to how we do that today, we mainly focus on like webhook integrations or whatever it might be. But there is becoming more of a need to have this data kind of real time. And as James kind of explores in this book, which really resonates with me, is like the future of these streaming platforms and the future of events and data sharing. And how do you get access? What happens if I can just subscribe to a stream of data rather than setting up all this stuff all the time, this integration and testing and the things that we have to do? But anyway, a part in particular in this book that really stood out to me was this Wardley map. And as you can see here, I've highlighted on the left, is this discovery phase, discovery of producer and consumer and the need for that and where that is along this whole life cycle. And because it's on the left, it's kind of indicating that this discovery phase still kind of needs more work and it's not really ready for us to kind of move along in that sense. So it kind of just got me really thinking about how can we look at tools or ways in which we can, with event-driven architectures in mind, allow us to discover events and document events and producers and consumers easier. And that's the key really here, is easier and having that developer experience in mind. Now, as I was continuing to dive deep into event-driven architectures and standards and various things like that, I come across Fran Mendez on Twitter, right? And he was like, so I was building a tool and he was like, hey, would it be cool if you could integrate with AsyncAPI? And I was like, what's AsyncAPI? And I've come across, the async API specification, which is great. It literally solves a lot of the problems and things that I've been thinking about and things that I will kind of want to use and want to explore more. The ability to document the producers and consumers, the ability to go somewhere and see exactly what this application is doing from an event-driven point of view. And as I mentioned, the great thing about the specification, it allows us to write tools and kind of see what else is possible. So I started to look at some tools and build some open source documentation tools that kind of really resonated with the community and people online, that allows you to take like schemas or schema registries, for example, with EventBridge, and generate some documentation for you, some static content where you can go and host these things and kind of read and kind of document your schemas to the next level. And I also integrate this with AsyncAPI, which takes your file and transforms it into some kind of 101 documentation and static website as an experiment. And as I started exploring this, more and more people kind of found it useful, which I found very interesting, which kind of mapped to that whole discovery phase of event-driven architectures and that need to have something there to help these organizations scale their event-driven architectures in general, really. And as I focus on these tools and focus on kind of open source tools in general, I spend a lot of time diving into what is a successful open source tool look like. And it's kind of a lot of emphasis goes around documentation of the tool itself, but also the developer experience that you have. And when I start thinking about how people make websites and that experience with markdown files and also MDX files, which allow us to have components within markdown files to allow us to custom render things on the screen, I started thinking about, can we use markdown and MDX files to actually generate event-driven documentation and also include the async API specification in that to help this whole discovery and documentation phase that I've been thinking about. So I started thinking about how can I kind of line the three up, which is event-driven architectures, line it with developer tools and standards and specifications like AsyncAPI, and also try and create this developer experience where people already know how to kind of use the tool because they might be familiar with Markdown, for example. I really wanted to try and give something back to the community which allows organizations and people to really document these producers and consumers with visualizations and components and all sorts of things. And that's when I decided to kind of build an experiment with this tool called Event Catalog. Now, what is Event Catalog? It's an open source project that helps you document your event services and now domains. It can actually take your async API file or files that you have and actually generate into a static website, right? And you can also, the static website will also host mermaid diagrams and schemas and all sorts of things and 3D node graphs and integrates with async API as a plugin. So here's an example page of an event that on Event Catalog and what it might look like. And you can see everything here you can customize. So your producers and consumers on the top right, here is the event called item removed from cart as an example. It's a version 1.5.5 event and its producers is the shopping API. And we have a consumer, which is the customer portal. And this is all documented using Markdown. And also, you can also all document this using async API files. And what the plugin will do is it will take that and generate this for you. You can download schemas and you can also see the schemas or see custom MDX components, which is like mermaid diagrams, async API file renderers, and all sorts of things there. So here is the async API plugin. This is how it works. So when you initiate an event catalog, you install the plugin and you put the path to your async API file. And then when you run generate, what it will do is it will pass the file and generate your events, your producers, and your consumers. So what I'm going to do now is actually take you through a demo. What we will do is create a new catalog. We'll add an async API file, install the plugin, and we'll generate our catalog from our async API file, and then look into what else we can kind of do there. So let's have a look now and see that in action. So what we're going to do now we're in the terminal is actually create our new event catalog, and we do that by running npx at event catalog, create event catalog at latest, or without the latest command if you want, and then we're going to call it my catalog async API. And what I'll do that is when I press return, that will kind of set up the initial foundations of our event catalog. What I'll do for this video is kind of fast forward it, so it'll take a minute or two to do that, and then I'll show you how what it looks like initially and how we can use an async API file with the plugin that we use. Cool, so now what we're going to do once that's done is we're going to go into our async API event catalog, and then we're going to run npm run dev to just start it up and see what it initially looks like out of the box. So let's head over to the browser. Great, so we're now in the browser and you can see we're on port 3000 and our application is now running. And out of the box we get some standard stuff. We get events, services, domains and visualizer. And if we click on them, we can see if we go into the events, we can start to see all the types of events that we kind of get out of the box. We can use the filter here to start looking for events if we want to, and also filter by events by different services. We can also dive into services themselves and be like, okay, what is this service doing? So if we click on the basket service, for example, we can see the basket service itself is actually publishing these 3 different events. As we come down here, we're using MDX components to visualize the basket service and the corresponding events that it's raising. And also we can provide some metadata inside of this page, which is like the repository link, who owns the event, and maybe we can view it in the visualizer. If we head over to view in the visualizer, this will load the visualizer of our whole event catalog. And we can start going down here and exploring our events and our domains. For example, the basket service publishes this file, publishes this event, which is subscribed by the data lake. We can just start using markdown files to generate visualizations and documentations into event catalog, which is an awesome way to kind of just render some static content around your event-driven applications. So let's take a look at the code and just see exactly what it is that we get out of the box before we implement Async API. Cool, so now we're over in the code, and what happens outside the box, what you get is you get a domains folder, events folder, and a services folder. And all that's inside of there is markdown files. So as you can see, we've got our events, and we have an order complete event, and we have a markdown file here. And this markdown file, we have some metadata, and everything is documented online in documentation. But you can say, okay, the name is order complete, we have a version, we can put a summary there, our producers are these, our consumers is this service, and we also have some owners. And then we can use some custom MDX components that the community has built on top of event catalog to be able to kind of render different things inside of our event catalog itself. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to actually delete these, and I'm going to install the AsyncAPI plugin, and we're going to use an AsyncAPI file to generate this document, this catalog ourselves. So step 1, what we'll do here quickly is just delete domains, delete our events, and delete our services. And then what I'm going to do is head back over to the terminal, and we're going to install the AsyncAPI plugin. Okay, so now we're here. What I'm going to do is just install the plugin for AsyncAPI, and we do that by doing npm install event catalog plugin generator AsyncAPI. Let's go back to the code and set up the AsyncAPI plugin. And the way we do that is we go to the event catalog config file, and now we have to actually install and use the generator. And the way we do that is we include the generator part of the file, which is this. So generators, and we point to the AsyncAPI generator, and we need to pass it the path to our specification. So let's put the AsyncAPI file directly into the root of the project here. So what we're going to do now is create a new AsyncAPI file inside the root of our project, and I'm going to copy an example AsyncAPI file into here. So this is using the Streetlights Kafka API that you can find on the AsyncAPI project and examples repo. And we're going to use this to generate our event catalog. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the terminal, and now what we're going to run is npm run generate. What this will do is it'll take the AsyncAPI file and parse all the events and the services and turn them into event catalog information. So let's now run the catalog and see what it looks like in the browser. So now let's head over to the events folder, and we can see here that we have dim light, light measured, and turn off light, which is all version 1, which is our AsyncAPI version. If we click on dim light, we get shown the event itself, a command a particular street light to dim the lights. And if we scroll down, we can see the schema, and we can see this nice diagram here. We can also use Event Catalog to actually download the schemas themselves. So if we click on that, it will allow us to download it locally to our machines. We can also see the producers here. So we see the Streetlights Kafka API is the producer of this particular event. So if we go inside there, now we're in the services folder, we can now see the Streetlights Kafka API, which is all documented for us. Again, everything you see here is from the AsyncAPI file. We can see that the API itself consumes this light measured event, but also kind of produces this dim light and turn off event. We can navigate to the events and the producers over here in the messages. We can also use the visualizer to kind of scroll through the all the events and kind of visualize our whole landscape using this all events and services feature up here. We can drag our nodes and kind of start visualizing and seeing what is going on using this particular tool. And if we're interested in a particular service, we can come down here and click on that and see that itself. We can also start using the 3D node graph as a way to kind of visualize events going to and from this particular service. Now, this is great, but what happens if we make changes to our AsyncAPI file over time? What happens to Event Catalog? Well, let's make some changes to Event Catalog first, and then we'll make some changes to AsyncAPI, and we'll see how the two work hand in hand. Let's go back over to the code. And what we'll do now is we'll make a change to this dim light markdown file. So maybe we want to add some more context here. This is where Event Catalog can kind of really help you document your event-driven architectures alongside AsyncAPI. For example, because this is markdown, we could add any information we want here. We could just have hello world from my dim light. If you are going to use this, make sure you follow the instructions found in the project README, whatever else it might be. We can save that, and when we go back to the UI, we'll see that rendered. So let's have a quick look now. As we navigate to dim light, we can see here is our changes there. So let's make some changes to our AsyncAPI file and see what happens. So let's head over back to the code. In our AsyncAPI file, let's update the version to version 1.1.0. And let's say we want to change dim light to have some different kind of summary. Command to book a particular street light, let's just say. Let's have a look at the dim light payload, and let's change some stuff here. Let's say the maximum is no longer 0 to 100, but for whatever reason is a 0 to 1000. We save the changes here, we've updated the version, and what we're going to do now is run generate again to generate our new events. And what Event Catalog will do with the configuration that we set, it will actually understand that the versions have changed and it will version the events for us. So let's go ahead and run this command, and then I'll go back to the browser to show you exactly what has happened. So what I've done here, I've run the generate command again, which I didn't show you because it's just a console. But what's happened here is actually we've gone back to our event and it's actually upped it to version 1.1.0. Now the README file hasn't changed, it still stores our information, everything below this line is stored, but we regenerate this top bit using the metadata of your event. And also what you can do here is you can also go back and see previous versions of your AsyncAPI file. So an example here would be dim light version 1.00. If I click on that, we can actually see the old event, the old information, and we actually get a warning that we're currently looking at an old version here. And the great thing about this, we can actually diff the changes and view the changes using Event Catalog. So you can see here, schema version is updated from 1 to 1.1.0 latest. And even better, what we can do is we can add a change log to this version itself. So let's just go to the code quickly to add a change log. So example of adding a change log, what we do is we go to dim light, we see this new version folder, and then we can see 1.0.0. And if we come in here and we add a change log, And we can add any information we want here. Again, it's just markdown files, so we can say why this particular change was made. We save that, we go back to the UI, and as you can see, the changelog is now rendered. And this is another way to give developers and give people in your organization kind of just information about why your events are changing using your AsyncAPI file. So another great addition there to just help you discover and understand what is going on. So the final thing I want to show you is a recent addition to the event catalog, which is using AsyncAPI without the plugin. So what you might do there is you might define a service and actually use the AsyncAPI MDX file to generate the AsyncAPI documentation. Let me just show you a quick example of how you might do that. So if we go back to the code, what we're going to do is create a new service. Let's create a new service called My Service. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new index file. We're going to copy what we had here and put that there. We're going to change the name to My Service. And let's just change the summary in a minute just to be My Demo Service. Okay? And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to not render a node graph, but we're actually going to render async API component. Now what I'm going to do is put the copy this async API file and put it inside this service. Now what this component will do is it'll render out the async API file that's directly against this service. So if you have multiple services and multiple async API files, you can start using Event Catalog to render these things side by side. So if I save that, I'll show you exactly what I mean when we go back to the browser. So now if we click on services at the top, we'll see My Service, the one we just created. And if we click on this, it will show us that our new service, My Demo Service, what we just defined, and what it will do is render this async API file for us using the async API tools from the community. So you can come down here and you can see, okay, here are the servers, here are the different times of operations, look at the parameters and everything else like that. You can combine this with Event Catalog components if you want to render more documentation or render graphs or visualizers or metadata or owners or services, whatever you want to do. You can use Event Catalog with or without that plugin to kind of render these different services. So that's a quick demo of how you can use async API files and Event Catalog to generate static content that you can host anywhere for your development teams. You can use Event Catalog to document events, services, and domains, and use your async API files to help generate that. So hopefully you find it useful, and if you want to get started, head over to eventcatalog.dev, and what we're going to do now is just quickly summarize what we spoke about in this talk and extra resources to help you get started. So as I said earlier, the adoption of event-driven architecture is growing. We can see that in the community, we can see that with the technology and what it's allowing us to do with kind of less really within our organizations. And again, you can kind of see this definitely in the AWS community and the serverless community using event architectures to kind of boost their organizations here. When we look at event architectures in general, you kind of see these kind of themes that emerge that's allowing us to have loosely coupled systems, extend our systems with this whole producer-consumer relationship, and that itself provides agility to our organizations. But the problem is, as I said earlier, that when you go beyond that initial setup of event-driven architecture, problems really start to emerge. And more, often than not, it's not really technical problems, although there are some, don't get me wrong. It's more kind of behavioral problems or design problems or architectural kind of problems. And don't worry, the great thing is AsyncAPI is actually here to help. There's a great community behind it and great kind of passion and drive that comes from this project. So I really recommend kind of scanning this QR code if you haven't already. I mean, I guess you're at the AsyncAPI conference if you're watching this, but really dive in and check it out and check out the tools that the community have built there, which is awesome. If you're interested in documenting or a documentation tool for event-driven architectures, I'd love to get your feedback on Event Catalog, if you're using Async API and Event Catalog, or if you've got any more information or anything like that, just check out eventcatalog.dev and have a play with it. Check out the static content that's already hosted on the website as a demo. Hopefully it can help you in your organizations. If you want to kind of join the communities, come and say hello, or got any feedback or ideas, just get involved. On the left here we have AsyncAPI Slack channel, so again scan that code there and sign up. And then on the right we have Event Catalog Discord channel, so if you've got any ideas for plugins or any ideas or features or problems, we have a small community there kind of really helping each other, which is awesome to see. And kind of just exploring Event Catalog and just seeing how it can actually help your organizations kind of cross this boundary of this EDA kind of documentation and discovery kind of problems that we have. And thank you so much for listening. If you kind of made it this far and got to the end, my name is Dave Boyne. Again, you can find me on Twitter, Boyne123, and I just want to thank you all for listening to this talk, and also thank you all kind of for inviting me to the Async API conference to give this short talk to you all. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions, and thank you very much for listening.